The Excellence of Misfortune, Part 1. Life became stern to Marius. To eat his coats and his watch was nothing. He chewed that inexpressible thing which is called the cud of bitterness. A horrible thing, which includes days without bread, nights without sleep, evenings without a candle, a hearth without a fire, weeks without labour, a future without hope, a coat out at the elbows, an old hat which makes young girls laugh, the door found shut against you at night because you have not paid your rent, the insolence of the porter and the landlord, the gibes of neighbours, humiliations, self-respect outraged, any drudgery acceptable, disgust, bitterness, prostration. Marius learned how one swallows down all these things, and how they are often the only things one has to swallow. At that period of existence, when man has need of pride, because he has need of love, he felt that he was mocked at because he was badly dressed, and ridiculed because he was poor. At the age when youth swells the heart with an imperial pride, he more than once dropped his eyes upon his worn-out boots, and experienced the undeserved shame and the poignant blushes of misery. Wonderful and terrible trial, from which the feeble come out infamous, from which the strong come out sublime. Crucible into which destiny casts a man, whenever she desires a scoundrel or a demigod. For there are many great deeds done in the small struggles of life. There is a determined though unseen bravery, which defends itself foot to foot in the darkness against the fatal invasions of necessity and of baseness. Noble are mysterious triumphs which no eye sees, which no renown rewards, which no flourish of triumph salutes. Life, misfortunes, isolation, abandonment, poverty, are battlefields which have their heroes, obscure heroes, sometimes greater than the illustrious heroes. Strong and rare natures are thus created. Misery, almost always a stepmother, is sometimes a mother. Privation gives birth to power of soul and mind. Distress is the nurse of self-respect. Misfortune is a good breast for great souls. There was a period in Marius's life when he swept his own hall, when he bought a pennyworth of brie cheese at the market woman's, when he waited for nightfall to make his way to the baker's and buy a loaf of bread, which he carried furtively to his garret, as if he had stolen it. Sometimes there was seen to glide into the corner meat market, in the midst of the jeering cooks who elbowed him, an awkward young man, with books under his arm, who had a timid and frightened appearance, and who, as he entered, took off his hat from his forehead, which was dripping with sweat, made a low bow to the astonished butcher, another bow to the butcher's boy, asked for a mutton cutlet, paid 6 or 7 sous for it, wrapped it up in paper, put it under his arm between two books, and went away. It was Marius. On this cutlet, which he cooked himself, he lived 3 days. The first day he ate the meat. The second day he ate the fat. The third day he gnawed the bone. On several occasions, Aunt Gillenormand made overtures and sent him the 60 pistoles. Marius always sent them back, saying that he had no need of anything. He was still in mourning for his father, when the revolution which we have described was accomplished in his ideas. Since then he had never left off black clothes. His clothes left him, however. A day came at last when he had no coat. His trousers were going also. What was to be done? Courfeyrac, for whom he had done some good turns, gave him an old coat. For 30 sous Marius had it turned by some porter or another, and it was a new coat. But this coat was green. Then Marius did not go out till after nightfall. That made his coat black. Desiring always to be in mourning, he clothed himself with night. Through all this, he procured admission to the bar. He was reputed to occupy Courfeyrac's room, which was decent, and where a certain number of law books, supported and filled out by some odd volumes of novels, made up the library required by the rules. When Marius had become a lawyer, he informed his grandfather of it, in a letter which was frigid but full of submission and respect. Monsieur Gillenormand took the letter with trembling hands, read it, and threw it, torn into pieces, into the basket. 2 or 3 days afterward, Mademoiselle Gillenormand overheard her father, who was alone in his room, talking aloud. This was always the case when he was much excited. She listened. The old man said,
If you were not a fool, you would know that a man cannot be a baron and a lawyer at the same time.
Part 2. It is with misery, as with anything else. It gradually becomes endurable. It ends by taking form and becoming fixed. You vegetate, that is to say, you develop in some wretched fashion, but sufficient for existence. This is the way in which Marius Pontmercy's life was arranged. He had got out of the narrowest place. The path widened a little before him. By dint of hard work, courage, perseverance, and will, he had succeeded in earning by his labour about 700 francs a year. He had learned German and English, thanks to Courfeyrac, who introduced him to a publisher. Marius filled, in the literary department of the bookhouse, the useful role of utility. He made out prospectuses, translated from the journals, annotated republications, compiled biographies, etc. Net result, year in and year out, 700 francs. He lived on this. How? Not badly. We are going to tell. Marius occupied, at an annual rent of 30 francs, a wretched little room in the Gorbeau tenement, with no fireplace called a cabinet, in which there was no more furniture than was indispensable. The furniture was his own. He gave 3 francs a month to the old woman who had charge of the building, for sweeping his room and bringing him, every morning, a little warm water, a fresh egg, and a penny loaf of bread. On this loaf and this egg he breakfasted. His breakfast varied from 2 to 4 sous, as eggs were cheap or dear. At 6 o'clock in the evening, he went down into the Rue Saint-Jacques, to dine at Rousseau's, opposite Basset's, the print dealer's, at the corner of the Rue de Mézerin. He ate no soup. He took a 6-penny plate of meat, a 3-penny half plate of vegetables, and a 3-penny dessert. For 3 sous as much bread as he liked. As for wine, he drank water. On paying at the counter, where Madame Rousseau was seated, majestically, still plump and fresh also in those days, he gave a sou to the waiter, and Madame Rousseau gave him a smile. Then he went away. For 16 sous, he had a smile and dinner. Thus, breakfast 4 sous, dinner 16 sous. His food cost him 20 sous a day, which was 365 francs a year. Add the 30 francs for his lodging, and the 36 francs to the old woman, and a few other trifling expenses, and for 450 francs Marius was fed, lodged, and waited upon. His clothes cost him 100 francs, his linen 50 francs, his washing 50 francs. The whole did not exceed 650 francs. This left him 50 francs. He was rich. He occasionally lent 10 francs to a friend. Courfeyrac borrowed 60 francs of him once. As for fire, having no fireplace, Marius had simplified it. Marius always had 2 complete suits, one for every day, the other quite new for special occasions. Both were black. He had but 3 shirts. One he had on, another in the drawer, the third at the washerwoman's. He renewed them as they wore out. They were usually ragged, so he buttoned his coat to the chin. For Marius to arrive at this flourishing condition had required years. Hard years and difficult ones. Those to get through, these to climb. Marius had never given up for a single day. He had undergone everything, in the shape of privation. He had done everything except get into debt. He gave himself this credit, that he had never owed a sou to anybody. For him, a debt was the beginning of slavery. He felt that even a creditor is worse than a master. For a master owns only your person. A creditor owns your dignity and can belabor that. Rather than borrow, he did not eat. He had many days of fasting. Feeling that all extremes meet, and that if we do not take care, abasement of fortune may lead to baseness of soul, he watched jealously over his pride. Such a habit, or such a carriage as, in any other condition, would have appeared deferential, seemed humiliating, and he braced himself against it. He risked nothing, not wishing to take a backward step. He had a kind of stern blush upon his face. He was timid even to rudeness. In all his trials, he felt encouraged, and sometimes even upborne by a secret force within. The soul helps the body, and at certain moments uplifts it. It is the only bird which sustains its cage. Part 3. Marius was now 20 years old. It was 3 years since he had left his grandfather. They remained on the same terms on both sides, without attempting a reconciliation, and without seeking to meet. And indeed, what was the use of meeting? To come into conflict? Which would have had the best of it? Marius was a vase of brass, but Monsieur Gillenormand was an iron pot. To tell the truth, Marius was mistaken as to his grandfather's heart. He imagined that Monsieur Gillenormand had never loved him, and that this crusty and harsh yet smiling old man, who swore, screamed, stormed, and lifted his cane, felt for him at most only the affection, at once slight and severe, of the old men of comedy. Marius was deceived. There are fathers who do not love their children. There is no grandfather who does not adore his grandson. In reality, we have said, Monsieur Gillenormand worshipped Marius. He worshipped him in his own way, with an accompaniment of cuffs and even of blows, but when the child was gone, he felt a dark void in his heart. He ordered that nobody should speak of him again, and regretted that he was so well obeyed. At first, he hoped that this Bonapartist, this Jacobin, this terrorist, this Septembrist would return. But weeks passed away, months passed away, years passed away. To the great despair of Monsieur Gillenormand, the blood drinker did not reappear.
But I could not do anything else than turn him away,
Said the grandfather, and he asked himself,
if it were to be done again, would I do it?
his pride promptly answered yes, but his old head, which he shook in silence, sadly answered no. He had his hours of dejection. He missed Marius. Old men need affection as they do sunshine. It is warmth. However strong his nature might be, the absence of Marius had changed something within him. For nothing in the world would he have taken a step toward the little rogue, but he suffered. He never inquired after him, but he thought of him constantly. He lived more and more retired in the Marais. He was still as formerly gay and violent, but his gaiety had a convulsive harshness as if it contained grief and anger, and his bursts of violence always terminated in a sort of placid and gloomy exhaustion. He said sometimes,
Oh, if he would come back, what a good box on the ear I would give him.
as for the aunt, she thought too little of to love very much. Marius was now nothing to her but a sort of dim, dark outline, and she finally busied herself a good deal less about him than with the cat or the parakeet which she probably had. What increased the secret suffering of Grandfather Gillenormand was that he shut her entirely out and let her suspect nothing of it. His chagrin was like those newly invented furnaces which consume their own smoke. Sometimes it happened that some blundering, officious body would speak to him of Marius and ask, "What is your grandson doing, or what has become of him?" The old bourgeois would answer, with a sigh, as if he were too sad, or giving his ruffle a tap, as if he wished to seem gay,
Monsieur the Baron Pontmercy is pettifogging in some hole.
while the old man was regretting. Marius was rejoicing. Misery, we must insist, had been good to him. Poverty in youth, when it succeeds, is so far magnificent that it turns the whole will toward effort, and the whole soul toward aspiration. Poverty strips the material life entirely bare, and makes it hideous. Thence arise inexpressible yearnings toward the ideal life. The rich young man has 100 brilliant and coarse amusements: racing, hunting, dogs, cigars, gaming, feasting, and the rest, busying the lower portions of the soul at the expense of its higher and delicate portions. The poor young man must work for his bread. He eats. When he has eaten, he has nothing more but reverie. He goes free to the play which God gives. He beholds the sky, space, the stars, the flowers, the children, the humanity in which he suffers, the creation in which he shines. He looks at humanity so much that he sees the soul. He looks at creation so much that he sees God. He dreams. He feels that he is great. He dreams again and feels that he is tender. From the egotism of the suffering man, he passes to the compassion of the contemplating man. A wonderful feeling springs up within him: forgetfulness of self and pity for all. In thinking of the numberless enjoyments which nature offers, and gives lavishly to open souls, and refuses to closed souls, he, a millionaire of intelligence, comes to grieve for the millionaires of money. All hatred goes out of his heart in proportion as all light enters his mind. And then, is he unhappy? No. The misery of a young man is never miserable. The first lad you meet, poor as he may be, with his health, his strength, his quick step, his shining eyes, his blood which circulates warmly, his black locks, his fresh cheeks, his rosy lips, his white teeth, his pure breath, will always be envied by an old emperor. And then, every morning, he sets about earning his bread, and while his hands are earning his living, his backbone is gaining firmness, his brain is gaining ideas. When his work is done, he returns to ineffable ecstasies, to contemplations, to joy. He sees his feet in difficulties, in obstacle, on the pavement, in thorns, sometimes in the mire. His head is in the light. He is firm, serene, gentle, peaceful, attentive, serious, content with little, benevolent, and he blesses God for having given him these two ecstasies, which many of the rich are without: labour, which makes him free, and thought, which makes him noble. Marius had two friends, one young, Courfeyrac, and one old, Monsieur Mabeuf. He inclined toward the old one. First, he was indebted to him for the revolution through which he had gone. He was indebted to him for having known and loved his father. "He operated upon me for the cataract," said he. Certainly, this churchwarden had been decisive. Monsieur Mabeuf was not, however, on that occasion, anything more than the calm and passive agent of Providence. He had enlightened Marius accidentally, and without knowing it, as a candle does which somebody carries. He had been the candle and not the somebody. As to the interior political revolution in Marius, Monsieur Mabeuf was entirely incapable of comprehending it, desiring it, or directing it. As we shall meet Monsieur Mabeuf hereafter, a few words will not be useless. The day that Monsieur Mabeuf said to Marius, "Certainly I approve of political opinions," he expressed the real condition of his mind. All political opinions were indifferent to him, and he approved of them all without distinction, provided they left him quiet, as the Greeks called the Furies the beautiful, the good, the charming, the Eumenides. Monsieur Mabeuf's political opinion was a passionate fondness for plants, and a still greater one for books. He did not understand how men could busy themselves with hating one another about such bubbles as the Charter, democracy, legitimacy, the monarchy, the republic, etc., when there were in this world all sorts of mosses, herbs, and shrubs, which they could look at, and piles of folios, and even of 32 mots, which they could pore over. He took good care not to be useless. Having books did not prevent him from reading. Being a botanist did not prevent him from being a gardener. He went to mass rather from good feeling than from devotion, and because he loved the faces of men but hated their noise, and found them at church only, gathering together and silent. He lived alone, with an old governess. He was a little gouty, and when he slept his old fingers, stiffened with rheumatism, were clenched in the folds of the clothes. He had written and published a Flora of the Environs of Cauteretz, with coloured illustrations, a highly esteemed work, the plates of which he owned and which he sold himself. People came 2 or 3 times a day and rang his bell in the Rue Mézières for it. He received fully, true, 2,000 francs a year for it. This was nearly all his income. Though poor, he had succeeded in gathering together, by means of patience, self-denial, and time, a valuable collection of rare copies on every subject. The sight of a sword or a gun chilled him. In his whole life he had never been near a cannon, even at the Invalides. He had a passable stomach, a brother who was a curé, hair entirely white, no teeth left either in his mouth or in his mind, a tremor of the whole body, a Picard accent, a childlike laugh, weak nerves, and the appearance of an old sheep. With that, no other friend nor any other intimate acquaintance among the living, but an old bookseller of the Porte Saint-Jacques named Royal. His mania was the naturalization of indigo in France. His servant was, also, a peculiar variety of innocence. The poor good woman was a maid. None of her dreams went as far as man. She had never got beyond her cat. She had, like him, moustaches. Her glory was in the whiteness of her caps. She spent her time on Sunday after Mass in counting her linen in her trunk, and spreading out upon her bed the dresses in the piece which she had bought and never made up. She could read. Monsieur Mabeuf had given her the name of Mother Plutarque. Towards 1830, his brother the curé died, and almost immediately after, as at the coming on of night, the whole horizon of Monsieur Mabeuf was darkened. By a failure of a notary, he lost 10,000 francs, which was all the money that he possessed in his brother's name and his own. The Revolution of July brought on a crisis in bookselling. In hard times, the first thing that does not sell is a flora. The flora of the environs of Cauteretz stopped short. Weeks went by without a purchaser. Sometimes Monsieur Mabeuf would start at the sound of the bell. "Monsieur," Mother Plutarque would say sadly, "it is the water porter." In short, Monsieur Mabeuf left the Rue Mézières one day, resigned his place as churchwarden, gave up Saint-Sulpice, sold a part, not of his books but of his prints, which he prized the least, and installed himself in a little house on the Boulevard Montparnasse, where, however, he remained but 1 quarter, for 2 reasons. First, the ground floor and the garden let for 300 francs. and he did not dare to spend more than 200 francs for his rent. Secondly, being near the Factus shooting gallery, he heard pistol shots, which was insupportable to him. He carried off his flora, his plates, his herbariums, his portfolios, and his books, and established himself near La Salpêtrière, in a sort of cottage in the village of Austerlitz, where at 50 crowns a year he had 3 rooms, a garden enclosed with a hedge, and a well. He took advantage of this change to sell nearly all his furniture. The day of his entrance into this new dwelling he was very gay, and drove nails himself on which to hang the engravings and the herbariums. He dug in his garden the rest of the day, and in the evening, seeing that Mother Plutarque had a gloomy and thoughtful air, he tapped her on the shoulder and said, with a smile, "We still have the indigo." Only 2 visitors, the bookseller of the Port Saint Jacques and Marius, were admitted to his cottage at Austerlitz. A tumultuous name, which was, to tell the truth, rather disagreeable to him. Amid this darkness which was gathering about him, all his hopes going out one after another, Monsieur Mabeuf had remained serene, somewhat childishly, but very thoroughly. His habits of mind had the swing of a pendulum. Once wound up by an illusion, he went a very long time, even when the illusion had disappeared. A clock does not stop at the very moment you lose the key. Part 5. It was Marius' delight to take long walks alone on the outer boulevards, or in the Champ de Mars, or in the less frequented walks of the Luxembourg. He sometimes spent half a day in looking at a vegetable garden, at the beds of salad, the fowls on the dung heap, and the horse turning the wheel of the pump. The passers-by looked at him with surprise, and some thought he had a suspicious appearance and an ill-omened manner. He was only a poor young man, dreaming without an object. It was in one of these walks that he discovered the Gorbeau tenement, and its isolation and cheapness being an attraction to him, he had taken a room in it. He was only known in it by the name of Monsieur Marius. All passions, except those of the heart, are dissipated by reverie. Marius' political fevers were over. The Revolution of 1830, by satisfying him and soothing him, had aided in this. He remained the same, with the exception of his passionateness. He had still the same opinions, but they were softened. Properly speaking, he held opinions no longer. He had sympathies. Of what party was he? Of the party of humanity. Out of humanity he chose France. Out of the nation he chose the people. Out of the people he chose woman. To her, above all, his pity went out. He now preferred an idea to a fact, a poet to a hero, and he admired a book like Job still more than an event like a Marengo. And then, when, after a day of meditation, he returned at night along the boulevards, and saw through the branches of the trees the fathomless space, the nameless lights, the depths, the darkness, the mystery, all that which is only human seemed to him very pretty. Toward the middle of this year, 1831, the old woman who waited upon Marius told him that his neighbors, the wretched Jondrette family, were to be turned into the street. Marius, who passed almost all his days outdoors, hardly knew that he had any neighbors. "But why are they turned out?" said he. "Because they do not pay their rent. They owe for 2 terms." "How much is that?" 20 francs, said the old woman. Marius had 30 francs in reserve in a drawer. "Here," he said to the old woman, "there are 25 francs. Pay for these poor people. Give them 5 francs, and do not tell them it's from me."